Classroom, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. Our zip code is 20001. Next, we take you to the campus of the American University here in Washington, D.C. for our coverage of an American forum titled JFK, Cinema as History. The forum was held Wednesday evening, and it featured a panel discussion of Oliver Stone's controversial film JFK and its depiction of events surrounding the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. During the next couple of hours, you will meet a number of participants, including National Public Radio film critic Pat Dowell, 16-term Democratic Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas, and Colonel Fletcher Prouty, former Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Founded in 1986 by AU's School of Communication, the American Forum offers a platform on which some of the nation's most influential journalists, elected officials, and public policymakers debate the changing issues of the day. We now bring you our coverage of Wednesday night's event.
Okay.
Gonzalez right here. Steve on the other side of John, you were all right, John.
You see these signs reminding everybody. Just remember to speak into the microphone. Good evening. I'm Sanford Ungar, Dean of the School of Communication here at American University, and I want to welcome this enthusiastic crowd to the first in our American Forum series for this semester. I appreciate that it's pretty crowded out there, and I just hope everybody can push together a little bit to accommodate. I'm sorry for the discomfort. We would have moved this program to the Bender Arena, but a basketball game had already been postponed and rescheduled for tonight, and so the Bender Arena was not available, and our options were therefore limited. I want to welcome those who are in the K Spiritual Life Center with us, and also those who will be seeing this program when it is broadcast on the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network or listening to it on National Public Radio via the assistance of WAMU-FM, the American University Public Radio station. Our subject tonight is JFK, the movie, Cinema as History. We thank, as usual, the Xerox Foundation, the Washington Gas Light Company, Cable Holdings, and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation for their generous contributions that have made the forums possible. Our format is this. We're going to begin tonight by showing two brief clips from the film JFK, and then start our discussion among our panelists, and we will, as customary, leave time for approximately a half an hour of questions from the audience. I want to appeal now in advance to the members of this large audience that when it comes time for questions, if you'll come to the microphone in the center aisle, tell us who you are, and please try to give us a brief question so that there'll be plenty of time. We're not inviting speeches from the floor, so I'll appreciate it if people could try to respect that ground rule. After the program, there will be a reception in the University Lounge on the first floor of Mary Graydon Center down the quad, and if you follow the crowd, if you don't know how to get there, I'm sure you'll have an easy time. Let me introduce our panelists before we look at some film clips. Pat Dowell, on my left, is film critic for National Public Radio, WETA-FM, here, and various newspapers, and until recently, Washingtonian Magazine. She will explain that to us later. Her articles on film and her reporting on film has appeared in many publications, including the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, and American Film, and she frequently lectures at local universities and has served as a judge at film festivals. To her left is Stephen Rosenfeld, who is deputy editorial page editor and a columnist for the Washington Post. Steve Rosenfeld has worked for the Post since 1959. He has been, he was a Moscow correspondent at one stage, a city reporter, and previous to his, to that was an intelligence and communications officer in the Marine Corps between 1953 and 1955. To his left is Fletcher Prouty, retired U.S. Air Force colonel, who served as an advisor to Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and we're told is the model for the film's character X, played by Donald Sutherland. The resemblance is somewhat striking. Fletcher Prouty served as Chief of Special Operations for the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, and he's the author of The Secret Team, a book about his years in the Pentagon and the CIA. To my immediate right is Congressman Henry Gonzalez, a Democrat from the 20th District of Texas. Very pleased he could be with us tonight. Congressman Gonzalez has been in Congress for 30 years, I believe, first elected in 1961. He is chairman of the House Committee on Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs, and of the House Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development. In 1976, Congressman Gonzalez served as the first chair of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, set up to investigate the deaths of President Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King. To his right is John Judge, who co-founded the Committee for an Open Archives in November of last year. Mr. Judge is organizing lobbying efforts to obtain full public access to all materials relating to the assassination of President Kennedy. His analysis on this subject has appeared in Newsweek and in Spy magazine. To his right is Dan Moldea, an independent journalist who has specialized in investigations of organized crime since 1974. In his book, The Hoffa Wars, Dan Moldea was the first to state that former Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa and two mafia figures were involved, according to his version of events, in the assassination of President Kennedy. Dan Moldea has published his articles in the Washington Post, Regardes, Village Voice, and The Nation, among other places. We're going to pause now to dim the lights and look at two clips from the film JFK, and then start our conversation.
We should be investigating our mafia leads here in New Orleans. Now, I can buy that a hell of a lot easier than I can the government. Ruby is all mob, knows Oswald, sets him up. Hoffa, Trafficante, Marcellus, they hire some guns to do Kennedy. And the government doesn't want to open up a whole can of worms there because it used the mob to try to get to Castro. You know, Castro being assassinated by the mob by us, it sounds pretty wild to junk you citizen. So, they closed the book on JFK. Makes perfect sense to me.
I don't doubt their involvement, Bill, but at a lower level.
Oh, come on.
Could the mob change the parade route, Bill? Or eliminate the protection for the president? Could the mob send Oswald to Russia and get him back? Could the mob get the FBI, the CIA, and the Dallas police to make a mess of the investigation? I mean, could the mob get the Warren Commission appointed to cover it up? Could the mob wreck the autopsy? I mean, could the mob influence the national media to go to sleep? And since when has the mob used anything but 38s for hits up close? Mob wouldn't have the guts or the power for something of this magnitude. Assassins need payrolls, schedules, times, orders. This was a military-style ambush from start to finish. This was a coup d'etat with Lyndon Johnson waiting in the wings.
The cabinet was out of the country to get their perceptions out of the way. Troops are in the air for possible riot control. The telephones didn't work to get the wrong stories from spreading if anything went wrong with the plan. Nothing was left to chance. He could not be allowed to escape alive. Well, I never thought things were the same after that. Vietnam started for real. There was an air of, I don't know, make-believe in the Pentagon and CIA. Those of us who'd been in secret ops since the beginning knew the Warren Commission was fiction. But there was something deeper, uglier. I knew Alan Dulles very well. I'd briefed him many a time in his house. But for the life of me, I still can't figure out why he was appointed to investigate Kennedy's death, the man who had fired him. Dulles, by the way, was General Wyatt's benefactor. I got out in '64, resigned my commission.
I never realized Kennedy was so dangerous to the establishment. Is that why?
Well, that's a real question, isn't it? Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who?
Steve Rosenfeld, you have written about this film in the Washington Post and expressed your objections to it. I wonder if you could explain those to us now, being sure to use the microphone.
Terrific drama, at best questionable, at worst lousy docu. That's the heart of my objection. The film does not distinguish between the two. You are given the famous medical room, operating room scene in grainy black and white as though it's a real scene. When one tries to put together the picture, what one gets is an excellent picture of the thoughts of the director of the film, the relationship to history, to what I would call reality, at best unproven, and in fact, in my judgment, awful.
Pat Dowell, you make your living commenting on film. What is your reaction to JFK?
I thought it was a brilliant film. In fact, in many ways, I think it really is the American film of 1991, which is the year it came out. So most people will be seeing it in 1992, but it's really the film of the year for Americans, I think, because it challenges our ideas of what history is. I think you can't prove that anything the film says is true, because you can't prove anything with a film. I mean, when Kevin Costner as Garrison says towards the end about theoretical physics, that you could prove with theoretical physics that an elephant could hang from a cliff with his tail tied to a daisy, my immediate thought was, yes, and the other thing that can prove that is a film. But even though you can't prove the facts are true, the important part of the movie to me, and really what makes it valuable to us, is the fact that it reminds us that we only know as much of history as we're told, and that's often not the truth. As we're told over and over again, an individual has to make justice. It isn't delivered to us. But as for whether the facts the film states are true, that I don't know. I have no problem believing that a large conspiracy could exist, because certainly what we've seen in the last 20 years suggests that American military and business interests have subverted other countries, why not ours? So it seems to me that what you have to ask yourself is the larger meaning of it, and if you want to find out if the facts are true, you have to do the digging yourself. I understand, incidentally, that an annotated script is going to be published. That should help a little bit.
Congressman Gonzalez, you launched and supervised an investigation of the assassinations in Congress. Are you comfortable now with the state of our knowledge about the Kennedy assassination?
Well, let me clarify. I did initiate the first resolution in February of 1975, but realizing the constitutional inhibitions on the Congress's power to investigate, I did not call for a whodunit type of investigation, but rather wanted very desperately to have the Congress evaluate the impact of violence on a national level over an 8-year period, beginning with the assassination of John Kennedy, and then Martin Luther King, and then Robert Kennedy, and the attempt on George Wallace on the basis that every one of these had an impact on our democratic electoral processes of our government. But that was diverted. I also want to clarify that I was not the first chairman. I was the author of the resolution, and ordinarily, under the precedence and custom of the House, I would have been, but I wasn't. Outgoing Speaker Carl Albert, 3 weeks before the end of that Congress, decided to push for the adoption of some resolution to investigate John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King's deaths. I wasn't favorable to the notion of changing the thrust of the resolution, and so he appointed a lame duck member of the House as the first chairman, Mr. Downing of Virginia. Now this was September, 3 weeks before the end of the session, so that we had to reorganize all over again come January the 3rd, 1977. And the trouble then started, and frustrated, I resigned when I was appointed chairman in January of '77 by Speaker Tip O'Neill, the new speaker. The fact remains that I realized that when there's a crisis of this nature, there will always be a tendency to be hospitable to conspiracy theories. I was in the motorcade. I was behind the car that contained the vice president and his wife and U.S. Senator Ralph Yarborough. I heard the shots because I had lowered the window on the left side where I was riding in the car and heard them quite distinctly. I have not formulated any particular conspiratorial theory. I did end up in the hospital alone in the corridor with Mrs. Kennedy. The reason I wasn't in the plane, Air Force One, when Lyndon Johnson was sworn in was that I opted to remain there because she was alone. And it also happened through chance that I was standing right outside of the room where the president's body was laying. So I haven't formulated any particular conspiratorial theory because I believe that you have to adduce evidence more than rather vague circumstantial in order to establish any kind of a predicate that would lead to some kind of a formulation of an action of more than one person, which is a definition of a conspiracy. Now, I also will conclude by saying that perhaps I shouldn't be here because I haven't seen the film, JFK, but I have seen some of the first films of this genre. Executive Action, for instance, was very much of this type. Conspiracy was implied. It wasn't as forthright as I understand this picture is, but it was understood that it was a JFK assassination. So what I do think is troubling is that the nation, and the Congress particularly, because it's our national policy-making body, has never evaluated that impact on our electoral processes, which has been great. It led to the adoption of the 25th Amendment, which I consider to be a dagger pointed at the heart of our democratic system. Now, I know that sounds strange, but that's my convictions. So that I have no particular theory to dispute. I really am not qualified to judge the thrust of the film, other than to say that it doesn't evoke, and it can't. We live in a day of television. Even in the case of the Abraham Lincoln assassination, 126 years later, we have theories about what really happened. Booth escaped. He ended up in Texas. He died in Oklahoma. So you're going to have this forever and a day. And what I think is atrocious is that the committee that ended up in formulating the conclusion that it was likely that a conspiracy was to blame for the death of Kennedy wasn't more specific, and then sealed the documents.
Congressman, before we move on, I do want to ask you this. You were there at the assassination.
I was.
And are you not troubled by the fact that you still really are not satisfied that you know what happened that day and who was responsible?
Well, I came up in a way that I became inured to random violence. I had been present when people had been shot just 3 yards, shot to death. I had faced a gun being placed in my midriff and the trigger pulled. President Kennedy did not understand that. If there was one, there were certainly 2 occasions in which I ventured forth to say that there was a terrible aura of hatred directed to him, particularly in my area. It's difficult to evoke now, after his death, where the image is that he was very popular and the quintessence of American youth. Yes, he was, with a big portion of the American population, but there was also a very, very strong environment of hatred, terrible hatred. I've never received the hate mail that I did the first year that I came to the Congress, which was 61, 62. And I couldn't convey that. Even within the Congress, in the House, some of the leaders spoke terribly about the president. The other little established fact is that on that day, November the 22nd, 63, not one appropriation bill had been approved for the first time in peacetime. That to me is something you can't evoke now. Also, today we take for granted the tremendous security we have. We're used now and inured to go in the airport, getting checked. At the time he died, President Kennedy died, you could go at midnight on a Sunday to the Capitol and walk at random and nobody would challenge you. Now that can't be evoked, and I don't think the film would. But we live in a day and time in which when you have a crisis of this kind, they're difficult to explain. In a day of TV, the conspiratorial feeling is going to be prevalent. One of the latest cases, for instance, was Mayor Barry. How many times did we read in the newspaper that it was a white conspiracy against the mayor? We're prone to that in a day of television in which images are dramatized, they're personalized, they're difficult to understand from an abstract point of view. So I think I've overextended myself.
Okay, thank you. Fletcher Prouty, you are represented by Donald Sutherland in that second film clip that we saw. And I wonder if you can explain to us in real life what it is you believe that Donald Sutherland, in representing you, was saying at that point. I take it you do believe that there was a conspiracy to murder President Kennedy.
You know, what has happened since we came out with this film is really unbelievable. I don't know what people look for when they think of the word conspiracy. It's just astounding. If you make a plan to do something, that's a normal human arrangement. But if you add evil to that plan, and there are others with you, that's a conspiracy. Now, you don't decide that in court. You didn't go out and find another murderer. You didn't go out and string up a whole bunch of things and question history all the way back to wherever you want to go. The conspiracy is laying right out in front of us, and don't we recognize it? I got off a plane coming up from the South Pole, and I was in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I heard the British radio come on and say, President Kennedy has been shot, dead, in Dallas. Just that way. I'll never forget the phrasing of it. I was with a congressman. We had all been down the pole. We went up the street, see what we could do to get some more news. And about 2 to 2.5 hours later, we found a man selling extras on the street. I bought the paper and I looked at it. At that time, I had been at Pentagon for 9 years working on special operations. That means clandestine operations, the military and the agency working together. I was pretty familiar with this sort of thing. And on the front of that paper was a picture of the school book depository building where the alleged killer had been. And I looked at it, windows were open. You know, when we protect the president, we go there ahead of time. We make sure the building overhead windows have been closed by people that are trained to do that. Another thing, the thing said, 3 bursts of automatic weapons. Now, I don't know, Congressman, whether that's what you heard or not, but that's what the reporter said. That's not what the FBI said. The FBI said, bing, 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 from that man on the 6th floor, and that's all there was to it. 3 bursts of automatic weapons by a reporter that was on the scene. What bothered me more, not then but later, was the bottom third of that paper was a whole story of Lee Harvey Oswald. Been to Russia with the Marines at Atsugi, and I read Atsugi. Atsugi was at Far East headquarters of CIA. I've been there many times. In fact, I was there before the surrender of Japan, a couple of days before, when we were getting prisoners of war out. It's an underground base. The only Marines we take to Atsugi in the military and CIA work, like on the U-2 and all that sort of thing, are the cream of the crop, or they don't get there. While Oswald was at Atsugi, we tried to help a rebellion against Sukarno in Indonesia. He was one of the men picked to go down to that Indonesian campaign. He was no dud. Don't let anybody kid you. So when I got home, I checked that biography of Oswald. Pretty interested by the time I got home. I got home 8 days later. And I found out that the police had not even charged Oswald with the crime by the time that story was in the New Zealand newspaper. Now, I understand how fast news can go in communication, but I mean, who put it all together? Where did they get the news of this random 24-year-old, even though he did have an unusual history? At least we hear that afterwards. Before that, it was a pretty exemplary history, to tell you the truth. I've been at Atsugi during the period when he was there. I never met him, but I know the quality of people we used there. Well, you add these things up. Failure to have the military unit there that provides protection for the president in any city where he goes. I've gone to Mexico City for that purpose. The failure of the Secret Service to be adequately stationed throughout the city. And this story, written before the police even knew who the killer was. Here, the writer of this story knew all about him before the police did. How many things do the autopsy reports are a mess? How many things do people need to wake up? That's what Oliver Stone's trying to do. He wants the American public to know that since 1963, we've been told a lie. Lyndon Johnson, before he died, said, and it's right over in your library, Atlantic Monthly, July 1973, I've always believed there was a conspiracy. Our ex-president, Lyndon Johnson, and he said Oswald did not do it by himself, and he said, we have been operating a murder incorporated. That INC on the end, incorporated, means a murder organization in perpetuity. Unfortunately, as an individual, I can report to you that during my work in the Pentagon, I have been required to work among that situation where people have been murdered by something that we maintain. In the 70s, Senator Church pulled that information out of the CIA bit by bit, even though there was perjury committed. Now, you've got to be serious about this movie. It's not a joke. People tell us we've got the history wrong, we've got all this other stuff wrong. I'd like to see anybody in this room or anywhere else lay the line of history down that came from that movie and tell me that it's wrong. It might be a change in how the film was presented. After all, it's a movie. I mean, what do we see in movies anyway? Well, I've spoken too long, but this is a serious film. It's not a joke. And I can't believe it. When articles appear in the Washington Post and call me a flunky in a JCS when I was colonel in charge of secret operations, special operations for 9 years. I knew what was going on in that Pentagon, and I knew what was going on in the White House. And any of you want to know about it, I'll talk with you later.
Dan Moldea, in the first clip that we saw, one of the assistants to District Attorney Jim Garrison in New Orleans is advancing a different theory, that it was a mob killing of President Kennedy, and I take it this is a theory, perhaps not in the exact words of the film, but a theory to which you subscribe.
Well, although I credit Oliver Stone with resurrecting the national debate on this issue, I am a little critical of him because he takes a premise and then he takes any shred of evidence, regardless of merit, regardless of sources, and then simply uses it in the movie in order to bulk up his his basic premise itself. Organized crime, any reasonable definition of organized crime is that it is conspiracy crime. It is enterprise crime. And in any probe of underworld activities, there are bottom-up investigations. Our investigations concentrate, in this particular case, on specific evidence, working from the bottom up. We are clearly aware of the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. We are clearly aware, and the evidence is clear, that there are wiretaps where mafia guys were threatening to kill the President of the United States. We have interviews with Ed Parton, the key government witness against Jimmy Hoffa in his jury tampering trial in Chattanooga, that Jimmy Hoffa was planning to kill Bobby Kennedy in September of 1962. And that in that same month, we have interviews with Eddie Becker, who was talking to Carlos Marcello, who said, we are not going to kill Bobby Kennedy as Hoffa wants to do, we're going to kill the President of the United States. We have interviews with Jose Alaman, who was talking to Santos Trafficani in that same month of September of 1962, when Trafficani said that the President is going to be hit, and that Hoffa had made the contract on the President's life. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald was raised by a guy by the name of Charlie Dutz Maratz, who was running Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of New Orleans, bookmaking operations. We know that David Ferry was a personal associate and aide to Carlos Marcello, who was in court with him at the moment of the President's assassination. We have Jack Ruby's telephone records, which show calls to and from Ruby from a variety of associates of Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, and Santos Trafficani during the days and weeks prior to the murder. We know that Jim Garrison's probe was a deflection away from Marcello and the mob because of Garrison's own complicity with Marcello in New Orleans. We know that during the Bry Lab investigations, there are 3 sealed tapes, which the New York Times reported today, in which Carlos Marcello made veiled admissions that he was directly involved and responsible for the President's murder. Now, last week, we have Frank Regano, the attorney for both Jimmy Hoffa and Santos Trafficani, who has flat out said that it was Jimmy Hoffa, Santos Trafficani, and Carlos Marcello who arranged and executed the assassination of the President of the United States, and that he wishes to testify under oath before the appropriate congressional committee in order to get the truth out after all of these years. What we are suggesting is let's get Regano before a committee, let's get him deposed, let's get what his story is, and let the evidence go wherever it goes. Oliver Stone speaks in theories and premises. The people who are advocating that organized crime should be the principal target of this investigation are speaking from facts and specific, credible evidence.
John Judge. You favor opening the archives. I wonder whether you have any preliminary hypotheses about what would be found there if the archives were opened.
I think more important than what specifically remains in the archives, Norman Mailer compared it to a Mercedes-Benz that's been left, I think he set up in Harlem for 20 years in terms of what we might find. But we do have lists of what was put in, so we can at least compare them to what comes out. But I think what's more important is the principle that this is public information and it belongs to us, the people of the United States, and not to any secret government or intelligence network or any president or any Congress who were merely hired by us to do our bidding anyway. You know, Thomas Jefferson said that given a choice between a government with no newspaper and a newspaper with no government, he'd always choose the latter. Of course, he never had a chance to read the Washington Post or the New York Times, but the principle he was getting at is that democracy doesn't work unless the people are educated. And he said that the final repository, the ultimate repository of all knowledge must rest in the people, and that there's no one else who's good enough or smart enough to invest that control in a truly democratic society. And we call for a full opening of the files, not dribbled out through pre-censorship like Freedom of Information Act documents with pieces missing, not to selected historians or medical experts, not to a special prosecutor or yet another congressional investigation, but to the people themselves. And much of this that we know about the Kennedy case and the evidence of conspiracy comes from the hard work of independent individual investigators whose names are not mentioned in large part in the film. Mae Brussel, Penn Jones, Sylvia Marr, Holcomb Heston, Paris Flamand, and that's only a few. The current researchers, Robert Groden and Philip Melanson, are still continuing to follow the evidence. When that material comes out, they will be extra little pieces in the jigsaw puzzle, in the mosaic. But we've had enough out in these many years to solve the case. There's enough of the picture visible in the record and in the historical view that we've had in order to get at the bottom of it. So I don't see the files ultimately as holding so much of a smoking gun as merely telling us one more time what the government did or didn't find out about the case. I would like to support the film. I think that outside of the films done by Civil War buffs who try to get every uniform and every rifle right, that Oliver Stone has done the most historically accurate work on the Kennedy assassination to date. The reason it struck a nerve is that this is the hidden secret in the American psyche since that day, November 22nd, 63. The American public has known, and in fact I would contend has been told over and over, that there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States, that the people who did it got away with it, and that we can't touch them. And I think that that's in large part why so few people vote nowadays. But Stone has gone into that darkness and shone a light and looked at things. And I think the conclusion of his film is right. I think from my own work, I read the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. You know, Allen Dulles, when he was asked about releasing the evidence by Hale Boggs, said, go ahead and print it, nobody will read it anyway. And unfortunately, especially now in a post-literate generation, Stone's film is about the only thing that will reach youth. There are a few of us who read still, but as you well know, the FBI is trying to get our name from the library. So this has crossed over the line, and it's why it's so disturbing. But let me tell you two stories to end that convinced me that this was not only a conspiracy, but a conspiracy well beyond the capability of any mafia goon, of any CIA schlepper, of any renegade element in the U.S. intelligence, of any oilman with a beef. These are the layers of the onion that were planted at the beginning so we'd never see the core. My mother worked for 30 years altogether, but 25 years for the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Personnel Office of the U.S. Army, directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She was the highest paid woman employee of the Pentagon. She was 5 levels above top security. I mentioned to Fletcher Prouty the other day, I work from the bottom up and he works from the top down, and we met at the Joint Chiefs. My mother's job was to project overall national draft call figures 5 years in advance. She had to project an annual national selective service call that was right within 100 people either way, 5 years ahead. She knew from those projections and from the information she got that they were withdrawing from Vietnam. And if you want to get hold of the papers that prove Prouty's point, I just got this today at the Government Printing Office, Foreign Relations of the United States, 61 to 63. The State Department papers are released in Volume 4 of the Vietnam series. This is August to December 1963, and the security memoranda are in there to talk about Kennedy's plan. It's been backed up by Arthur Schlesinger, and more recently, yesterday I believe, or the day before in the New York Times, by Roger Hilsman. He was pulling out. My mother knew that because she had to project those kind of figures. I asked her after she retired, when did they tell you they would escalate in Vietnam? Because she had to be among the first to know. She said late November of 63. I said the last week in November. She said yes, the Monday following the assassination. I said, was this a few more advisors, a change in policy? She said, I couldn't believe the figures. I took them back to the Joint Chiefs in what must have been the first protest by the civilian community to the war in Vietnam and said, these can't be right. And they said, you'll use them. They told her November 25, 1963, that the war in Vietnam would last for 10 years and that 57,000 Americans would die, and to figure that in. I also talked to SAC bomber pilots, Strategic Air Command bomber pilots, who have the responsibility of nuclear and emergency response, who are in the air on regular shifts, 24 hours a day. These were in the air over Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when they heard the news that Kennedy had been shot. They ran to open lockers that contain a cryptographed code book that allows them to tell whether the president is calling them and to take orders that go all the way out to fail-safe and nuclear war. There was not a pilot in the air that hour, over Wright-Pat anyway, and I would contend this is the case everywhere else, no reason to isolate it, that had a code book in that locker. We know from Pierre Salinger's book that there was no code book aboard Air Force Two, bringing the entire cabinet back from important meetings that changed the course in Vietnam in the next few days. They were in the air and had no way to communicate with the White House or the President. There's nobody that can touch those books besides the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest levels of defense intelligence. And at every level of my work, the Office of Navy Intelligence is who rears its head on the mechanic level, the Defense Industrial Security Command. This is the background of Oswald and Guy Bannister and Jack Ruby when we go into them. And whatever is in the record will merely back that up. The physical evidence is already in front of us, so we know that one lone nut with an old gun that lost the war for the Italians in World War II, which couldn't even shoot a bullet to line up with its own scope, didn't do the damage in Dallas. But Kennedy wasn't all that was killed that day. Democracy died.
I want to come back around to something that you said, Pat, and I want to give Steve Rosenfeld a chance to respond to some of these points. But you said that you're not sure it matters how accurate the film is, how accurate the history is. And other people are saying the history is exactly accurate. What I'm wondering is whether, have we really reached a point where history, the history we can all have some confidence in, is going to be determined, our most believable version of history will be determined at the box office, or by people, voting with their feet about which theory they believe.
Well, with all due respect to the panelists, who all have marshaled an enormous number of facts, the fact is that you listening out there, and I myself, because I'm not a conspiracy buff and I haven't perused all the literature, you can't tell from listening to any of us what the facts of the case are. Just as you can't tell from seeing Oliver Stone's movie. I mean, we can say whatever we want, but you don't know that it's so just because we say it. You have to go out and find it out to find out whether it's true. I think the film has pushed a button because it really goes to something deeper than simply a 28 or 29-year-old murder. I think people do want to know who killed Kennedy and why, but I think that the reason that is such a burning issue is to some extent what John Judge said, that in fact, I don't think it's so much that democracy died that day, because I'm not so sure democracy was hale and hearty before that day. But I think America has begun to catch on to what happens in its government. And in the last 20 years, we've been catching on more and more, and people are sick at heart about it. The film speaks to that. And what the film does, well, it's a little like something that Kevin Costner says at one point in the movie. He's reading the books, Garrison is, when he's first getting interested in the case, and he's saying, it's all here, but it's all broken up into all these little pieces, and you can't tell what's going on. And what the film does, it brings all those pieces into one place and shows you that they are indeed fragments of a whole lot of different realities. That's why you have all those different kinds of film stock. You use all those different frame sizes. I mean, he really is presenting you with this huge banquet of evidence that he thinks all stacks up a certain way, but he leaves you enough room to agree or disagree. I, for instance, have trouble believing that Kennedy was as dangerous to the establishment. That's what we saw in the clip. Was Kennedy? I didn't know Kennedy was that dangerous to the establishment, Garrison says, or Stone in this case, because that's who the conversation was with, really. And my thinking is, well, yeah, I thought Kennedy was the establishment. And so, I think what's going on here is people are grappling with something else that the film crystallizes for us rather than just the case of this 28-year-old murder. And it really goes to the press and the policymakers, and that's why they've ganged up on the film. And I can give you a personal example of this. I have been the Washingtonian's film critic, the Washingtonian magazine here in Washington, for 10 years. But last Friday I resigned because the editor of that magazine, Jack Limpert, spiked my 100-word review. I write thumbnail reviews for the Washingtonian. He spiked my review of JFK, which in magazine parlance means that he cut it from the February column that it was going into, that I write. And we had an exchange of letters about it, and I told him I couldn't continue. And he told me that the reason he cut it was because it seemed to him that Stone's film went to the heart of what kind of city this is. In other words, In other words, there are a lot of people, and most of them have access to print and to broadcasting channels, who believe that this is really an insult to the people that they report on and consort with most of the time. In other words, to the policy makers, rather than those...
They believe the film is an insult.
I think so. I think that explains a lot of the really vehement reaction to it. You know, yours was actually fairly mild, I thought, in your column. You were pretty fair. I mean, you didn't foam at the mouth, it seemed to me. And I've seen some articles where people foamed at the mouth. Actually, your paper has run some where people foamed at the mouth about it. And it seems to me that that's what's going on here with the press attacking the film, and that in fact, and it's mostly the editorial press, the op-ed press, because critics have either loved it or hated it, but most of them have loved it, actually. The Post's critics raved about it. Time and Newsweek critics raved about it, even though the newsweeklies managed to get onto their cover taglines. They managed to print titles across their cover that suggested that the movie was a distortion, pardon me, a distortion of history, even though their critics said they thought it was a really quite a brilliant movie.
I guess those become two separate questions. Whether it's a brilliant movie and whether it's good history.
Well, yes and no. I think they're related. I don't think they're entirely unrelated
Excuse me, Sandy. Can we interact among the panel?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
By all means. But I was coming to Steve Rosenfeld, but go ahead, Dan.
Well, I just simply want to say, when you buy a book, you know whether it's fiction or nonfiction. When you go to see a movie, you just don't know. And Stone labels this movie as being dependent on two books, Garrison's and another fellow, what's his name, Mars? And he attempts to portray it as nonfiction, and this is, excuse me, this is an interpretation. He portrays this as being an interpretation of a true story, but he's sort of blurred the distinction. And I also think that that's one reason why Stone's getting a lot of grief right now, but he's also getting a lot of grief because he has used Jim Garrison as his motif for this movie himself. Once again, Jim Garrison, the evidence is clear, was in the pocket of the New Orleans crime syndicate. That is never portrayed in the film itself. The one thing that Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, David Ferry, and Jim Garrison had in common was their connection to the Marcello crime organization. Once again, Marcello's investigation, and it's been repeatedly proven, was a deflection away from the investigation of the mafia, where the most credible evidence currently exists. That's the reason why Oliver Stone is taking as much grief as he's taken, because the movie simply lacks integrity.
Steve Rosenfeld, you've been credited for not foaming at the mouth. What is your feeling about? There is a sense that somehow the establishment, the media establishment, or some figures in it are ganging up on this movie, and this is what Pat Dowell is saying too. Now,
but I don't think it's a conspiracy.
Now Dan Moldea says it's because it's for other reasons, but how do you feel about that?
Journalists have only one basis on which they can approach the public, and that is that what they're saying is as close to the facts as they can manage. Doesn't mean they get all the facts or all the facts right every day, but certainly the pursuit of fact is the only reason for being a journalist. Along comes a movie producer who, as Pat Dowell says, gives us what she calls fragments of realities and a banquet of evidence. And yet, the film is a farrago, if I may use such a word, of truths and untruths, of the products of some realistic documentation and the products of a fevered imagination. When I realized I was going to have the privilege of hearing Colonel Prouty tonight, I said, aha, this will be my chance to see what really was going on in Oliver Stone's mind as he made this film, because surely Colonel Prouty, being familiar with the material, would have another view of it, because I couldn't understand how anyone in the film, Donald Sutherland, who was spinning together this mad web of circumstance, I didn't think that it had any coherence at all. Dramatic coherence, perhaps, but factual coherence, no. Instead, I'm disappointed, Colonel, if I may say so. You arrive at the town in New Zealand and see a newspaper article and you say, huh, that's got a lot of detail in it. And you give us some other extremely interesting factoids, little small facts unrelated to big, large facts about your passage through New Zealand and your passage through the events leading up to this story. Who among us would like to be convicted of a crime on the basis of the sort of evidence that you, sir, presented?
You slept through what I said, didn't you? I said a lot more than that, didn't I? I talked about 9 years in the Pentagon. Did you hear that? Did you hear anything about the 9 years in the Pentagon? Any at all? I was 1 day in New Zealand.
Speak into the machine, please.
Were you listening?
Colonel, you'll have to speak in the microphone or it's wasted.
Okay, well, I'll speak in the microphone, but he slept through when I was talking about my 9 years in the Pentagon, but he didn't sleep through that 1 or 2 days in New Zealand. Now, come on, wake up. That's the trouble with your paper. When one of the finest writers in the New York Times, Tom Wicker, said there's no reasonable historian that would find any basis for the fact that Kennedy was making plans not to build in Vietnam and actually to get out of Vietnam with American troops. And he said no basis for that. That book that John just held up contains more than 50 meetings that my own boss went to, General Krulak and the JCS, with Kennedy, Maxwell Taylor, Rusk, and McNamara, building those plans from August of '63 until he was killed, well, until October when the National Security Act Memorandum number 263 was written. And good old Tom Wicker, working like mad up there, has never noticed that or anything else. What on earth are they trying to tell us? You know what this means, free the files? It's a euphemism for free the press.
Congressman Gonzalez, how do you think this is going to evolve as an understanding of history? Will we arrive in any reasonable period of time at what we might regard as the truth about the assassination?
Well, as I said earlier, when these events occur, it's very difficult for the mind to accept what seems to be unexplainable and unacceptable. So we will have in this day and time, given our television age, more conspiracy settings than perhaps before. Nevertheless, your question, I think, is very pertinent, and I think that one shouldn't be angry at the fact that the movie was manufactured, that Stone has, again, pricked the conscience, the dormant conscience, as Mr. Judge said, the psyche, because it is something that has troubled the American conscience consistently. Look, this is 30 years later. The young students here today weren't even living at the time of President Kennedy's death, yet they have continued a strong and enduring interest in ascertaining an answer to some of the questions that have naturally arisen because the circumstances surrounding that assassination are bound to give rise to questions. The fact that there's very little understanding about the limitations in our branch of the government with respect to direct investigations as to who done it also complicates the problem, because the executive branch did appoint a commission known as a Warren Commission. The thing there was that you cannot recall the pressure under which that commission was acting. They were under the gun to issue a report before the year was up, and they did. The one good thing of the Warren Commission, like the good thing that comes out of these movies, is that it presents, it acted like a vacuum cleaner, and it amassed 26 volumes of documented evidence. For instance, there's nothing in the proceedings of the commission that indicate they evaluated the full role of Ruby. Yet in the documentation, you'll find a lot of documentation showing Ruby's background as a professional hitman in Chicago. That all has implications. But what I'm saying is that the impact on our electoral and democratic processes has been great and detrimental. And there, I think the Congress fell down on its job because of its aborted attempt to do the extra constitutional thing that it has no power to do, and that is to act as if it were an executive branch investigating committee, as if it was a special CIA or FBI, which it can't be, and it won't ever be. But I do think that the movie, if anything, and as I said before, I qualify my opinion because I haven't seen it, but I think that it does serve a purpose in reminding us that there is a continuing responsibility to understand that period of violence. We had 8 years of national violence on a level that we had not experienced before, and it had an impact on our governmental processes that we are reacting to today. The era of secrecy. I wasn't aware that the House committee had sealed documents. It's abhorrent to my concept of a congressional committee's action.
Excuse me, Congressman, how do you handle, in your career, how do you handle confidential witnesses and libelous information? Do you release all that information? That's basically what's in the House Select Committee on Assassination, what's in the boxes right now, what's about to be released.
Well,
would you give out confidential source information or libelous information?
Well, in what instances did the committee entertain in camera or in executive session any witnesses where the testimony was not printed forth? I don't know of any. I've been in political elective office for 38 years, 7 months, and I'll tell you the truth, I haven't seen one instance yet in which secrecy was ever justified, where what we were told in executive session, the banking committee, 6, 7 years ago, the regulators saying, oh, well, we can't tell you the true state of some 300 institutions because it's very delicate. When we met in executive session, we didn't know any more, any less than before. When the House resolved itself into an executive session in 1982, on the basis that we were going to be briefed by the CIA on the Nicaraguan situation, where President Reagan had said that the city of Harlingen, Texas was in a direct path of invasion from the Contras. Now, how do you evoke that today? I didn't go to that executive session. I have voted against every vote to convert the committee, banking committee, into executive session. Nevertheless, under the rules, it is provided for. Now, you ask a question that would be more pertinent to the Armed Services Committee, where you might have sensitive national defense information. That's understandable. But in a case like this, I don't know what witness is going to be damaged by unfounded rumors. And who's going to be the judge? A handful in the Congress to say, well, this is the information we think it's too dangerous to put out, so we'll seal it. Or the people, or those that are charged or have assumed the responsibility of following through on evaluating the workings of that committee. We have had for ages in the history of the House and the Senate tension between the executive branch and the Congress about the providing of information and document from the president or the executive branch. And the president exercised an executive privilege. Now here we are doing the same thing in this case. I think that's abhorrent. And that's the reason that, the only reason I'm back is that I'm introducing the resolution to release those sealed documents. And that's all. I'm not asking that we go and form another committee, because I've seen that the Congress has fallen down on that job.
I'm going to ask people with questions to come to the microphone in the center aisle in just a moment. But before we get to those, I just want to, and Steve Rosenfeld, it may be unfair to turn to you for this question, but there seems to be, the Warren Commission seems to be, whatever anybody believes, whatever anyone thinks or accepts, it seems not to be the version advanced by the Warren Commission. And I wonder, in your view and your understanding, is there anyone left who defends the Warren Commission? My second question to you is, are you opposed to opening up these files and to having this material looked at by a broad public now?
There are people who defend the Warren Commission. One, of course, is David Beale in the council. Gerald Ford, who was then a member of the commission, also defends it. But I would say otherwise, the circle is exceedingly small and narrow. I think the consensus view, which I certainly accept, is that it was a rush job designed not so much to get the final answer to this difficult question as to settle down a nation thought to be struggling in a great trauma. The Warren Commission report has not stood the test of time well, and that in its failure, which I think is a fair word, lies the soil in which the various conspiracy theories have arisen.
Do you believe a desirable purpose would be served by opening up all these files? Some of them do seem to have been sealed for a long time.
Chairman Gonzalez, I think, is well known in the Congress for believing in open government, and I certainly support what he says. Dan Moldea puts a little asterisk on there, material having to do with personal questions unrelated to the substance of the inquiry or libelous material. A bargain was made with the providers of evidence, and I think that has to be kept. But unquestionably, all of our confidence would be served if that information would be revealed to the public. It interests me that people on different sides of this question, Mr. Judge and myself, both, I think, of course, Mr. Judge is a leader in the effort to open the files. He doesn't think that the public's view, or at least his own view, if I understood him correctly, is going to change much on the basis of what comes out. And Dan Moldea, coming from another point of view, suggests the same thing. So I think that the release of the information is necessary, but whether it's going to resolve the type of argument we continue to have over the question, I'm not at all sure.
Excuse me, may I say something?
Go ahead, Dan.
I think one of the reasons why the Warren Commission, the documents, we don't hold a great deal of hope for that is because the FBI was the lead investigative agency in the Warren Commission investigation. J. Edgar Hoover had basically denied the fact that organized crime had existed for years. To all intents and purposes, he didn't have the bureaucracy in place within the Bureau to handle organized crime investigations. And secondly, Allen Dulles, who was the creator of the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, never brought these plots up before the commission itself. It's difficult for me to believe that had the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro been brought up before the Warren Commission, that would not have created a whole new avenue of investigation for the commission itself.
Dan, in a sense, the theory that you support, that you believe in, is dealt a setback by this film. Certainly there appear to be, this is not by any means a random sample of people who've turned out tonight for this forum, but this film seems to have evoked a very positive response from a lot of people, and particularly young people. How do you go about challenging its view with your view?
With the evidence. As I stated earlier in the program, the evidence is clear about this. I don't preclude other people being involved in this thing, but right now we have adequate evidence, enough, I believe, to haul in the court. I think that the situation is one in which we have to evaluate the evidence. We have a witness who has now confessed to being a principal in all of this. He is willing to testify under oath before Congress. I think that all of us should support his right to testify before Congress and then follow the evidence wherever it goes. If it goes into Mr. Prouty's Vietnam scenario, fine. If it goes into John Judge and all of the things he believes, fine. I just think that the investigation has to start someplace. Those of us who've investigated organized crime's involvement in all of this have put together a roadmap for this, and I think it's simply a matter of following this credible evidence that has already been established.
And who should do it? I think Pat Dowell might say, if you want to get the theory well accepted,
well, that's the thing that's really troubling right now. We have Frank Regano, who said he's willing to testify, and willing to make a statement. The Justice Department has not grabbed him yet. Had I been the director of the FBI, I would be down there sealing him up. No congressional committee has grabbed him yet to get his deposition, so we've been trying to negotiate with the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the United States Senate to at least take his deposition in executive session before he gets clipped, which I think is a real danger. Remember Johnny Roselli, remember Sam Giancana. Before they had a chance to tell their story about this matter, they were whacked out in very horrible ways. And I don't want to see this happening to Frank Regano. I was talking to Frank today, and Frank is terrified right now because nobody is coming to him to take his deposition.
Chances are, well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, chances are, if you get the Congress involved, you will have a movie about it. We've had several movies from Congress this year and last year, and look what happens when we do, because you can see the facts presented in a sort of a way in a congressional hearing, and what happens is that people have entirely different opinions then about what they've seen and what those facts constitute and who those people were that they saw on television. Spilling their guts, if you will. And it seems to me that you still come back to the problem that you open the files, you write a book, somebody else writes a book. It's still a question, really, of someone's interpretation. Well, it'd probably be Oliver Stone, don't you think? If this film actually does well, there could be a sequel, right? If they open the files.
RFK.
Yes, that's right, RFK, and then MLK.
Oliver Stone would do with that.
Dr. Unger,
I'm sorry.
There's an important point.
Congressman Gonzalez and then John Judge.
Well, there's an important point here on this question of who's going to investigate. The committee, in its final report, came to the conclusion that it was most probable that there was a conspiracy involved in the death of President Kennedy. Then it said, we recommend that this matter be investigated by the FBI and the Justice Department. Now, the committee never followed through, and as far as I know, the FBI never acted on the recommendation of the committee. So, it's very interesting to note that even though the Warren Commission, yes, did divert personnel from the FBI and CIA to work in its fact-gathering efforts, that here is a committee saying, well, we have reason to believe this was a conspiracy, but we don't know exactly how, but we now recommend, as one of our fundamental recommendations, that the Justice Department and the FBI pick up on this and follow through on an adequate and exhaustive investigation.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, you won't be picked up by C-SPAN, and I think the viewers are entitled to see that, so I'll ask you to come to the microphone, please, and I'll call on you in just a moment. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to permit people to shout from the audience because it's not going to get us anywhere. So if you want to shout, go outside. If you want to communicate, come to the microphone.
The point she was making was...
I didn't hear the last remark anyway.
The point she was making was that it came public that Gerald Ford was reporting directly to the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover about the internal workings of the committee, and Hoover had reason to concern himself. I think that Dan Moldea mentioned the deaths of Roselli and some of the mobsters, which I felt didn't fit the classic pattern of mob deaths anyway, but in fact CIA hits, especially Giancana's death at that time, who had employed Ruby in Chicago in the 50s. And in fact, when I went into the Chicago Rackets Commission, when
Giancana in the 50s, that's new evidence. What's your evidence on that?
Well, they had called him from the Waste Handlers Union in Chicago to testify, and he refused to go to the committee.
I think that was in 1939, 1940. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right. It's the 30. I'm sorry, but there were later investigations that involved Robert Kennedy. Is this what I'm talking about? And in these racket investigations, and they attempted to call Giancana, and he refused and was taken in, actually into custody for refusing. And then they attempted to take his second in command, Jacob Rubenstein, in Chicago, And I found a letter in the records from the White House from Richard Nixon saying, don't subpoena this individual. And there was evidence that Ruby himself had in that earlier period worked with the FBI, and much of Ruby's connections to both the FBI and military intelligence have been drawn out by some of the researchers. But a more important death, I think, was that of William Sullivan, a person who headed up Division 5 of the FBI, the Domestic Operation Division, who came in with Cartha Dick DeLoach in the 40s from the Office of Naval Intelligence, promising Hoover that they'd protect his turf from the CIA. And eventually, I believe, compromised the workings of the FBI to a large degree. And this Navy intelligence thread is the one that I find most significant in the background of Oswald, who was a Navy intelligence operative, and Guy Bannister, the person who's depicted in New Orleans in the film. Oswald didn't have mafia jobs; he had intelligence jobs. From Atsugi to the job he had in New Orleans at the William Riley Coffee Canning Company. The president of that company was the main financial angel for E. Howard Hunt's Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front down there in New Orleans, and he had a job as an oiler, and he could go out.
Excuse me, John. You're saying that Oswald was created essentially to do this job? I mean, he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. John Kennedy wasn't even president then.
That's right. No, he doesn't have to be created to do the job, Dan. What I'm saying is he's got a history. Even the defection itself is clearly phony and set up by Navy intelligence. He gets his discharge because a box dropped on his mother's nose 9 months before, and the letter documenting it arrives 4 days after he gets the hardship. You try it in the Marines. And, he was positioned. He moved on orders, but these were intelligence orders. And at Jagger Childs Stovall, he had to have Navy security clearance to work in that shop because they looked at all the photographs that the Navy did from their satellites. And in fact, it was from that shop when he was working there that the pictures in '61 went to John Kennedy with the missiles in Cuba that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so there's much more of a background of ties to intelligence. It's not that the mob couldn't have been involved, but the mob, in terms of the real power in this country, as far as I'm concerned, are nothing but shoeshine boys, errand boys for the people that really control and pull the strings. And they don't need the mob. They don't need somebody who can blackmail them later. And the mob aren't the only ones that know how to shoot a gun.
Pat Dowell, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
You know, it's really fascinating to hear all these things. I have to say, I said before, I'm not an assassination buff. I was in Dallas when JFK was killed. I lived there, I grew up there, and I was in high school. But that's about as close as I've come to the whole thing, besides this movie. Well, but, in listening to all this, I keep coming back to this, if they open the files, and I'd really like to be around to see that, I still think it's probably not going to give us the smoking gun we want. The fact is that no matter how many facts we get out here, we're still dealing with people's interpretations of those facts and how those facts are put together. I mean, that's what nonfiction is, that's what history is. When you read a nonfiction book, you're really reading someone's interpretation, someone's opinion about what the facts are and mean. And what I hope comes out from this film, and its greatest service, I can live with not ever really knowing to a legal certainty who killed Kennedy and why, but I hope that what comes out of this movie is that it stimulates us, that it enrages us enough to deal with the government that we have now rather than the conspiracy we had then.
On that note, if there are questions, will you come to the microphone and tell us who you are?
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Jeff Ballou. I'm a graduate student in journalism and public affairs here at the American University. I'd like to ask any of the panelists a fundamental question that Pat Dowell had alluded to, and that is, supposing the files were open, supposing all the evidence Colonel Prouty presented, Mr. Moldea presented, everybody presented was out for consumption. This raises the question of what is history, what is fact, what would it do to our national fiber, and how would we act on it? And would we be able to believe anything anymore, not just about government, but about each other?
Or even what Hollywood has to say, right?
That's what I want to throw out to anybody. And that shakes at a fundamental thing of what do we stand on, if anything.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, I do think that's what makes the movie so convulsive. for us is that it suggests that, no, we can't believe anything, and that's a very uncertain, obviously, place to be. What's not so clear, and what Stone doesn't really have anything more to say to us, to help us as an artist, is at the end when Kevin Costner lifts his eyes to the camera and says, "It's up to you." It's not so clear that we're up to it, but, that really is what's left to us, I think.
Any other thoughts on that? What can we believe? Colonel Prouty, what can we believe?
It's an interesting discussion. I'm absolutely astounded by the development of it. Whenever you run a clandestine operation, you run two things at the same time. You prepare the team for the hit, and you keep it so small there's nobody to spread it all around. And across the hall is a big staff working on what we call special plans. I've got a book from the Pentagon here, and I can show you those. They're preparing the cover story. The cover story is what they want people to believe and to talk about and to argue about and everything. That's what the Warren Commission report is. It's the cover story. Can't we understand? What's the matter with us? If somebody took money out of our bank account, we'd figure it out quicker than this, And this is regular. When I came into the Pentagon in 1955 and we started this work, across the hall from me, I was special operations, clandestine operations, was a cover story office. When I went down to the Joint Chiefs of Staff to set up the same machinery for all services in the military, what was the office across from me? Special plans, setting up cover story. When 2 or 3 mechanics, hitmen from Murder Incorporated, killed Kennedy in Dallas, the rest of the whole story is a cover story. You ever hear of the Mongoose program? It costs $50 million a year to set it up and provide these kind of people. Now, the camp for these people is not in the United States. We wouldn't do that. There was a major general working with me in the Defense Department. He came back one day from the White House. He said, "Prouty, go get me my retirement papers right now." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Those bastards in the White House are going to kill that man." He said, "He's one of the finest anti-communist leaders we've been working with. They're going to kill him." And they did. The next day, they assassinated the leader of a country. These things happen. Don't we know what's going on?
Well, I think people do recognize that the Warren Commission is a cover story. Our problem now is that everything is a cover story. Who elected Ronald Reagan? How did George Bush get to be president? How did the hostages get free? How did Iran, how do our allies shift from day to day depending on, who we're running guns to? Everything's a cover story on the nightly news now.
Well, that gives you
Where
something
did
to
my
talk
bank go? What SNL failed? Why can't I buy a decent airline ticket? Everything's a cover story now. That's our problem.
Excuse me. Excuse me, could I address the cover story issue? I want to ask you.
Go ahead, Dan.
Mr. Prouty, I'm just out of wild curiosity. You're talking about the cover story. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations said that there was a probable conspiracy in the John Kennedy murder and that it was probably arranged by organized crime. Are you saying that Louis Stokes and Robert Blakey, the chief counsel of the committee, were putting together a cover story for the American public?
Read it. You believe all of it?
You're saying these men of impeccable credentials and reputation have put out nothing more than a cover story to the American public?
The hardest work is to prepare the cover story. And look how good it is. It was published in 26 volumes, the Warren Commission now, 26 volumes. In 1964, it became public. And those 26 volumes have been living up to today. We still have to argue whether it's true or not. And it is being perfected from day to day because it keeps up with what's happening. There's a power keeping it going.
So now Louis Stokes and Robert Blakey and the members of the committee are now part of your conspiracy then? Is that basically what you're saying? That they are now a part of this cover story? Well, because that'll tell, if you answer that yes, that's going to tell me a lot about everything else you've been saying about this.
For instance, how did it happen that the first writers to find fault with Oliver Stone's film, before he had put it in the theater, before he had finished the script, they worked on the first copy of the script before they even waited for the 7th copy of the script. How did it happen that the people that wrote that generally write what they call a national security column or something like that? And all of a sudden they became movie critics before the movie was even in a theater. Are we kidding ourselves? How many times do we have to say George Lardner that I used to work with when I was in the Pentagon is writing about this film, what was it, 2 months, 3 months before it came out? A pack of lies is what he wrote. Now, George Lardner's not dumb. Where does the power come from that requires a man like that with a great record to do something like that?
So you're saying George Lardner's part of the cover-up,
Where does the power come from to make a man? Where does the power come from to make a man like Earl Warren, a Chief Justice of the United States, sign his name to the Warren Commission report?
Colonel Prouty, I used to work with George Lardner. Steve Rosenfeld still does, and he's not here tonight to defend himself. We asked him to be, and he chose not to be on this panel. But I don't know that we want to accept as fact that George Lardner has written a pack of lies about this film.
His article, not George. I've known George for years. He called me before I write the story, and he wanted to know if I had any information on NSAM 263 because he heard it was going to be in the movie, and he wanted to know about it. That thing has been available in books since 1963, and he wanted to know something about it.
The point is that George Lardner does not write about national security. Not that he does write about national security, but that he doesn't, and that's why he called you to ask you about that document. If he wrote about national security, he wouldn't have needed to call you and ask
then,
that.
in place of that, the article that he wrote is just loaded with things that are not true. Now, why did he do that?
Are you saying that he's part of the cover story, too? Are you saying he's part of the cover story, too, then? I mean, you've just defamed 3 people here. Louis Stokes, Robert Blakey, the chief counsel of the Assassinations Committee, George Lardner, one of the finest reporters in the country, and you're saying they are all now part of this cover story, which is consistent with what you were saying in the movie, the Mr. X thing in the movie, that all of these people are part of this grand cover-up, and all of these people were part of this conspiracy against the President of the United States. I view this as being demagoguery of the worst degree. And I think that's what you're trying to portray here. You guys are grabbing at everything, taking the big pretext, and then coming down and taking any shred of evidence, regardless of its lack of merit, its sourcing, and you're applying it to this ridiculous conspiracy theory that the government of the United States arranged and executed the murder of the president.
Well, you might have been out of town when the Post published an article by ex-President Gerald Ford and David Billen of the Warren Commission report, in which they hit me very hard with an untrue statement. The Post was kind enough to print my reply that was the true report. Jerry Ford and Bellin told an untruth. Now, I don't think Jerry Ford tells untruths, maybe on the golf course once in a while, or that David Bellin does, a lawyer out in Des Moines. But in the case of the movie put out by Oliver Stone, they did. What's the compulsion? Why did they do that? Because the minute I wrote back to the Post, they printed my letter and corrected the untruth. The same with Tom Wicker. Times printed my letter. I mean, I'll take you up on that anytime you want. If they're publishing things that they know are untrue and their papers are going to reverse, if I take the time to write to the paper, then for goodness sakes, listen to what I'm saying.
Steve Rosenfeld, briefly.
You find as further evidence of a conspiracy that a newspaper publishes promptly a reply to an attack upon you, a normal journalistic purpose.
In most cases.
I think the point is that people who bring up the document, if you want something ridiculous, try and take the Warren Commission report and relate it to the volumes of evidence. I did. Nothing backs it up. I even found they brought somebody in from the Pentagon to write the Warren Commission report that wasn't even on the investigative staff. And when I went into the minutes, the staff critiques the report line by line. Hale Boggs and Richard Russell and John Sherman Cooper all wanted to have an alternate report, and Warren wouldn't allow it. And, you know, you can't take that evidence and put Oswald in the 6th floor window. You can't prove that he owned a gun or fired a gun that day. You can't make that gun do what was said, buy one gun in any way. And so you're left with using the evidence that they present and better evidence that's come out since. The fact that 2 guns were firing. Either you think that there were 2 lone nuts who happened to show up in Dealey Plaza on the same day at the same time with Kennedy in mind, or you have a conspiracy. Now, what that conspiracy is a deeper question, and it takes more work. You don't have to believe any of us on what we say. You shouldn't. Go do your homework.
We're going to have a time problem pretty soon. I'd like to get to some of the questions of people who've been on their feet, ask you to ask brief questions, and I'll try to produce brief answers.
This is a question that has been alluded to by...
Closer to the microphone, please.
This is a question that's been alluded to by several of the panelists, but I think if Mr. Rosenfeld could address it. I'd like to know why the press as a whole has not been as tenacious in following this Kennedy assassination story as they have been in other stories, and why they're still afraid to print, for example, Mark Lane's books and articles.
Okay, I'm sorry, you didn't identify yourself, and that's one of our ground rules. Can you tell us?
Okay, my name is Elise, and I am a graduate student here.
Okay.
Fair criticism of the press for not dogging this story over the years. Some writers have, book writers. Dan Moldea is certainly one of them. Perhaps others whom we could name. The movie, it is a reproach to the press that it took a movie to blast us all into action again on this. I suppose we didn't do as well as we should, and we ought to be more attentive. I hope, in fact, I'm confident that you will find no conspiracy in this and just routine laggardness.
Another part of the question is why Mark Lane's writings are not given more attention.
Gee, I thought he was a pretty important figure in the discussion. I'm not a great expert. Others can advise. We all know his name, don't we? His views are a familiar part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Pamela Dieters, and I'm a voter, and I am very nervous. I am extremely nervous up here, but I think this is important. What I want to know is, I listened to the Diane Rehm show, and I heard John Judge and Fletcher Prouty on there, and you were talking about a high cabal. What are we talking about here? I want some information. I want to know some specifics.
I think, let me repeat the question because some people couldn't hear it. The question said that she heard the two of you, Colonel Prouty and Mr. Judge, on a radio program here in Washington, and that you were talking about, I think she used the term high cabal, and she would like you to define this more specifically, and I would add briefly.
Well, one way to try to do that, if it isn't already known, I was at the Cairo conference in 1943 where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Chiang Kai-shek met. I was at the Tehran conference a few days after that where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met. Well, between Cairo and Tehran, I flew the plane that flew the Chinese to that delegation. But you never hear in any book, any history book, any paper, any magazine that I know of, that Chiang Kai-shek was at Tehran. I met Elliott Roosevelt en route there. And years later, I read a book by the man that has a job equivalent to Chief Justice of the United States, Lord Denning in England. And he was speaking of the time of World War II and how his friend Winston Churchill would from time to time refer to a high cabal. And Denning's view was, my God, in the middle of World War II, in his position, if there's a cabal higher than Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek, it's a high cabal. But now, if you hear Churchill saying that, I think you begin to see what the whole story is. I noted among the Chinese that I flew to Tehran were people who were working for TV Sung, a Chinaman, the wealthiest man in the world at the time. And his wife was married to Chiang Kai-shek, and his wife went to the conference. She hadn't elected or head of state or anything like that. Averell Harriman was in Moscow, and we all heard what Averell Harriman had to say about World War II and also about the Vietnam War. There's a high cabal, and we better learn it and understand it, and it tells people how to do things, when to do them. It exists.
Do you mean by that, moneyed interests of like mind, or do you mean something on the order of, something as fantastic as, a group of men plotting the domination of the world in just those terms?
My boss, Krulak, wrote a book in which he states that in pursuit of his assigned duties, he was working on a strategy for the Marines. He was the chief Marine of the Pacific at that time in Vietnam. His strategic plan was approved by the Commandant, first of all by CINCPAC in the Pacific, Admiral Sharp, then approved by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, then approved by McNamara. And McNamara said, but just a minute, before you go to the White House, I want you to talk with Abel Harriman. So he phoned Abel Harriman, and Krulak got invited to lunch. He briefed his whole plan, which had been approved by all the military from Westmoreland on up to McNamara. And Harriman said, General, there's no way we can do that. So the general went back to Hawaii. He got a call after he arrived there from General Greene, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and he said, I have arranged for you to meet with Lyndon Johnson. Flew back, went to see Lyndon Johnson. And here is a strategic military plan for forces in Vietnam. Remember, it was the Marines that landed there first in 1965. So he was responsible for the Marines operating on it. Told the whole story to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson said, no, we can't do that. So they went back to Hawaii. Admiral Sharp, who was CINCPAC in Hawaii at the time, in other words, nominally in charge of all forces in the Pacific, has written a book you all ought to read called Strategy for Defeat. Now, the military men didn't write that strategy. I grew up with General Abrams from my hometown, the first man I reported to before Pearl Harbor when I came on duty, the greatest battle commander in World War II under Patton. He was head of the brigade under Patton, and later on, as you know, he was chief of all forces in Vietnam. When he was briefed by Johnson and told to go to Vietnam, he said, General, he said, you have 550,000 Army troops out there. You've got the best Navy in the 7th Fleet, and you've got an Air Force that's dropping more bombs than we dropped in World War II. Go out there and do it. And General Abrams, Mr. President, may I ask your definition of that last word, go out and do? It? What is it you are expecting the military to do? And he got no answer at all. Now, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, because if the generals weren't running it, and if Dean Rusk wasn't running it, and if McNamara wasn't running it, think.
I think that history shows us over a long time that there are concentrations of wealth and power, first by theft, and then later when we have the machinery to create wealth by other design, and concentration of control over resources and over the politics of situations. If it's worth $10 million to put the CIA to throw over a government in a country like Chile, then what do you think the elections are worth here in the United States, where things reside at the level that the world can be controlled? And so I think that there isn't one. I don't think you have to think of conspiracy as a certain group of individuals, a team of 5 that sit in a boardroom and call the shots. More likely, as in all human affairs, there are many cabals, and they compete with one another, and they jockey for positions of power, and they kill one another. And I think that Kennedy got in the way of one that was particularly powerful at a particular time. He had his own. But these concentrations of wealth and power operate at a level beyond what's up there. And with apologies to Senator Gonzalez, I think that Bill Moyer's idea is exactly reversed in the secret government. He says that the government, Congress, make a mistake by going out and hiring these mafia goons and gun runners and drug carriers, and they shouldn't sully themselves with that, and they should stick to more honorable men. I think that those gun runners and opium dealers are the real government of the United States, and they're clandestine intelligence operatives, and that they in turn pay many people in 3-piece suits to stand up in front of us and tell us it's the other way around.
Next question.
My name is Paul Ruther, and I'm here in my capacity as a tax-paying citizen and voter. I have a brief statement about the movie and the media's reaction to it, and a question. I was distressed particularly by the media and, of course, my own local paper, the Washington Post, treatment of the movie. The movie is called a myth. It brings untruths to the general public. The government created the myth that Oswald killed the president. Then the Warren Commission is the documentation of that myth, and the Washington Post and other media sources put the myth out. Oliver Stone presents one myth, the government and the Post present another. I fail to see that great of a distinction, except one is art and one is called journalism. My question is this.
Which is which?
As a voter, that's a good question. As a voter, it seems to me the least I can do is vote for someone who wasn't director of the CIA in the next elections. However, I did hear Mark Lane on the Diane Rehm show say that George Bush was not only director of the CIA, but that as far back as 1963 and even beyond, he was a member of the CIA. I would like to ask any of the panelists to confirm what Mark Lane said based on what they know, and be specific, please.
Anyone here have a confirmation that George Bush worked for the CIA before he was director of the CIA?
I never heard that charged, and wasn't a
Village Voice.
junk.
It's based essentially on three pieces of evidence so far that I've seen, two of them being internal intelligence documents. One was an FBI memo that concerned a debriefing by an FBI agent of a Navy intelligence person and a George Herbert Walker Bush at the particular address where he lived in Texas. And this debriefing was the day after the Kennedy assassination and seemed to concern the anti-Castro Cuban community in Miami and what their reactions would be. There was another document that talked about a George Bush of the CIA and his relationship to turning in another person, I believe it was, a guy named Parrott, who was with Young Americans for Freedom and the Young Republicans at the time. But there's some intelligence documents. And then the third area is the relation between the Bay of Pigs operation, potentially, and Bush, in that the code name of the Bay of Pigs was Operation Zapata, which is the name of Bush's oil company, and two of the ships used in the raid were the Houston, where he lived, and the Barbara, who he married. And I think we have other indications. The key is try to get Felix Rodriguez to tell you when he met George Bush, and you'll get the answer.
Next question.
Yeah, my name is Bill Barata. I'm from Arlington, Virginia, and unlike E. Howard
I have to ask you to get a little closer to the microphone,
Okay.
please.
I am from Arlington, Virginia, and unlike E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, I remember where I was on November 22nd, 1963. And I've got 1,000 questions I'd like to ask one of them.
Can you just give us one?
Okay. All right. Colonel Prouty, you say that you think that the security in Dallas that day was less than adequate or less than normal, I believe. Don't you think it's particularly inadequate in light of the fact that on November 9th of 1963, the Miami police recorded a conversation with a man named Joseph Miltier, I believe, wherein he described the fact that an assassination was in the works, or his word was actually in the working. I've heard the tape. And he also described that the president would be shot from an office building with a high-powered rifle, and that some nut would be picked up to throw people off. And one other thing. I can't remember it all, but there's just so much. I mean, if you need any further proof of a conspiracy, wouldn't that be it? And why wasn't the Warren Commission told about this? I mean, the President Kennedy's appeared on November 18th in Miami, 4 days before he was assassinated, and 11 days after this tape was made. And his motorcade was changed. He took a helicopter to speak to the anti-Castro Cuban community. But his motorcade in Dallas was not certainly changed, and certainly the security wasn't beefed up. Could somebody comment on that for us, please?
Somebody want to comment on the conversation taped in Miami? And
Yeah, the acoustics are horrible. Have you got an idea what he was
well,
saying?
yes. The gentleman is referring to a conversation that was taped in Miami, I believe on November 9th, 1963, in which somebody said that the president was going to be assassinated. Joseph Miltier. He appeared before the House Committee. Sir, it's only going to be worse without the microphone, so I'll try to represent it as best I can. And the gentleman suggests that this is further evidence of a conspiracy or part of the conspiracy, and wonders whether anybody wants to comment on that point.
I think there were several plans against Kennedy. In Miami, another one at the time of the Army-Navy game in October that was pulled back at the last minute when he had a cold. There were several points. Miltier, working with the far right wing, I think was privy to some of the details, but and there were different points. I think when you do this, you do it with several backup operations. I think that there's evidence that there were guns further down Stemmons Freeway if the Elm Street location had not been a go. But as Mr. X says in the movie, you leave nothing to chance.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Michael Weintraub, and I'm a freshman in the School of Public Affairs, and I feel that this Oliver Stone's movie provides a pretty valid argument for conspiracy, but the whole basis of that is whether or not it's a true movie or if it's just fiction. And I would like to ask Colonel Prouty if his part in the movie as X is true or not, or if it was fiction made up by Stone.
Colonel Prouty, the question is, the gentleman says that he believes the movie is convincing, but he wants to know whether it's truth or fiction, and he wants to know whether the part portraying you as X is true or not, or Oliver Stone's fiction.
I'll explain to you how that was created, because the words, the theme, the thoughts, the whole idea was in letters, not in a personal visit. I happen to have the letters with me. Jim Garrison had sent me the manuscript to his book, On the Trail of the Assassin. I read the manuscript and immediately wrote back to Jim, and that started, and I had known him before this, and this started an exchange of letters. Zach Sklar, the screenwriter, used the letters and the book in the development of the script. In addition, I had written a series of articles during the 80s about Vietnam, but elaborating very much on Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination and all that sort of thing. Oliver Stone heard about him and asked the editor of the magazine that they appeared in for copies of all the magazine. He was sent the copies. So Oliver Stone picked up material from magazine work that I wrote. The script is putting those together, and we wanted to bring the cameras to Washington because it wouldn't be right to make a film of John F. Kennedy without having Washington in it. So the scene between Costner and Sutherland is the screenwriters or directors putting together material that I can show you that had been written, some of it for years. And I don't think any changes that would affect its veracity, except the fact they were sitting down by the Vietnam Memorial instead of exchanging letters with each other. It's a true story, except for where they met.
The Vietnam Memorial, of course, didn't exist at that time.
Pardon?
The Vietnam Memorial, of course, didn't exist at that time.
Well, it certainly did. They were filming the picture in 1991.
Right.
And
Just curious, Mr. Prouty, does it disturb you at all that Jim Garrison was a shill for the local mafia in New Orleans? Does that disturb you at all, that he was accepting money from them and everything else? Does that bother you at all?
That Garrison?
That Garrison was accepting, that he was a shill for the New Orleans mafia, that he was accepting money from the Marcello organization. Does that disturb you at all? And that he is the hero of this film? And that none of this is pointed out at any point in this film?
I can see that for some people here, it needs kind of a basic explanation. When you look at the hundreds of books that are available on the subject of the assassination of the president, you try to get one that will bring to the public a pretty wide view of the folklore that has developed, so the public will start off on a level ground with people who have called themselves experts in this field. One of the latest books was Mark's book called Crossfire. Stone acquired rights to that book. And another of the latest books was Garrison's book on the trail of the assassin. Using those two books, he was able to present to the public this stuff we've been hearing all night, hearing a lot more about everything, you know, the autopsy reports and all the other things. I mean, remember the movie begins with this woman being thrown out of the car and things like that? They're all in the books. The advantage of using Garrison's book was that his words and everything he did is in the court transcript. So there's not much questioning it unless you want to go back to the court transcript and match it with his book. So it was as good a base to start with to bring the public into the film without too much comment about what it was, because it was just the folklore. It could have been 50 other books. He did use many other books, but primarily those two.
But Colonel Prouty, just to press Dan Moldea's question, Mr. Moldea says that Jim Garrison was accepting money from mafia figures in New Orleans, and that Jim Garrison's credibility is compromised on the basis of his associations with organized crime figures. And he is asking you whether that bothers you.
Well, that's what he said. If you want to believe it, that's what he said.
The evidence is clear. I mean, he was caught with the marked money that the IRS Criminal Intelligence Division put out. I mean, he was caught with the marked money. I mean, the evidence is clear on this, and once again, this is an indication of the lack of integrity that this entire film has, where this material is not dealt with at all in the film, that the principal suspects in this murder, at least according to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Carlos Marcello now turns out to have been the person who owned Jim Garrison, who had him on his payroll. I think that should be of some significance to the people who are actually starting to believe this paranoid paradise which Oliver Stone has put out.
Next question.
I'm Michael Schwartz, and I'm playing hooky from work to be here tonight. Mr. Prouty, Mr. X in the movie talks about the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guatemala. Were you present at the meeting where they planned to overthrow Arbenz, which led to one of the worst genocides? And one other thing, Mr. Gonzalez, will you continue your attempt to impeach Bush? And John Judge, can you comment on the bubble top? Who gave the order to remove it? Would it have been bulletproof, the bubble top on the car?
Okay, three questions. Colonel Prouty, were you present at the meeting where there was the plot was hatched to assassinate President Arbenz of Guatemala? Congressman Gonzalez, will you continue to, I'm sorry, I'm losing that question. Continue to
impeach George Bush?
Press the move to impeach George Bush. And John Judge about the bubble top. I'd like to try and get some quick answers.
And Mr. Prouty, I want details if you have them.
Come to the reception.
We're going to take one more question after this one, and I'd like to get some quick answers, please, because we're well over our time. Colonel Prouty.
As I explained, my years in the Pentagon began in 1955. Guatemala was prior to 1955. In 1954, I was in and out of Vietnam, flying with the U.S. Air Force, transport aircraft out of Tokyo and into Southeast Asia. I did not have anything to do with Guatemala.
Anything else? Any other meetings to plan murders or assassinations? You said you discuss it with whoever wants to know. I want to know.
Can you get anything out of that?
Yes, the gentleman wants to know if, about other meetings, any meetings you attended where assassinations were discussed. He wants specifics.
The assassination of whom?
Of anyone.
Anybody.
The assassination of anyone.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you.
He's not going to tell you.
I know about it, but I'm not going to tell you.
But before you said you'd tell us.
I'm sorry?
Before he said that he'd discuss it with whomever wants to know.
The gentleman says earlier you said you would discuss it with anyone who wants details.
I want everybody to know, and I want to know.
Trujillo.
Who? Trujillo.
Okay.
Dominican Republic.
That's enough.
Well, Mr. Schwartz, I did introduce that resolution on January the 15th of 91, and after considerable thought, I had been since August attempting to get the leadership to address the question of the president's supra-constitutional actions. And on the basis of that resolution, I was hoping I could get some attention, but then the shooting started 12 hours later, and I wasn't about to get any cosigner on that resolution, which I still haven't. However, it's consistent with what I have said and done since Lyndon Johnson. I question the president's constitutional authority to conscript an unwilling American and send him outside of continental United States without a declaration of war. That upsets some of the, as far as it's possible at this time, I think the question of impeachment would be moot as far as getting any action. All I wanted was to have a hearing before the committee, and I never did get it.
And Mr. Judge, the bubble top?
The decision to remove the bubble top from the car, as well as to change the route of the motorcade, happened at a private oil club. We don't know which one, but we have reason to believe it was Connolly's club, one that he attended. There were present an FBI agent unnamed in the record, a Secret Service agent by the name of Harold Wong, and 2 people from the advanced public relations firm, Saul Bloom Agency, where Oswald did some of his photographic work, where he worked at Jagger Charles Stovall, because they had better blow-up and reduction equipment over at the ad agency than the contractor did. Their names were Jack Puterbaugh and Elizabeth Forsling. She later married Leon Harris, the guy that ran the department stores there in Dallas and big money. She was referred to in those years as a Dallas contact by the Washington intelligence community. She later co-founded Ms. Magazine with another CIA agent by the name of Gloria Steinem. This is not an attack on feminism on my part. I believe in radical feminism, but people have histories and should be looked at. And she was the one that specifically brought up leaving the bubble top off the car. There was a conversation between, that Prouty mentioned on the radio, between LBJ and Hoover, where Hoover said the bubble top wouldn't have made any difference. But I think anything that would have deflected a shot would have had a significance to a gunman.
What about the popular story about JFK ordering the removal because he wanted to be a popular president in close touch with the people? Do you know anything about that?
Congressman Gonzalez, you were there. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think we ought to understand something here, Mr. Judge. I happened to be there the morning after the breakfast at the hotel in Fort Worth. It had been raining. When we took our place to leave the hotel to go back to Carswell Air Force Base, where we were going to fly 10 minutes over to Love Field, the presidential car was right in front of us. To my surprise, the sun came out, and I noticed, and I commented to those that were with me, look at this. And I noticed the bubble top emerging up, pulling back like a convertible car. So I don't know that it was removed. I think it was a type of car that had that capability. The reason you didn't have the bubble top was because the weather was no longer inclement by the time the parade in Dallas. However, there was one thing that was unusual. I've never been in any kind of a parade of that kind where the average speed was no less than 30 miles an hour down the main street in Dallas. It was very unusual. But I don't think we should consider that the bubble top was removed because there was some sinister. I think it was part of the fact that it wasn't raining any longer. Had it been raining, the bubble top would have been there.
That is what is called a disarmingly simple explanation, Congressman Gonzalez.
Those of us that worked in protection,
that makes Elizabeth Forsling Harris a weather woman.
The Secret Service did not have a bubble top that was effectively stop bullets, nor did they have one single armored car. FBI had them, not Secret Service, in 1963. We knew that in the Pentagon.
Next question.
My name is Cynthia Johnson. I work with Women's Strike for Peace here in Washington, D.C. I wonder if anyone here can comment on the connection between the CNS, the Committee for National Security, the American Bar Association, the Institute of Peace, and the ABA, the American Bar Association. I've heard there are some connections. And as Pat Dowell so aptly said, we are concerned with our government now, and I really, this is a very sincere question. I hope you won't take it as naive. But right now, in the last months, I've been very concerned about, well, one of the cover stories, and since we're dealing with secrecy and democracy in government, our hope for democracy, right now in Washington, or in the last days in Washington, the OAS, with our executive branch, has been negotiating for the constitutional return of the president of Haiti. Now, most Haitian people believe that this is a sham because our government is not, that the U.S. ambassador in Haiti is the person who's running that country. Now, he is an alumnus of the Phoenix program in Vietnam, and I very sincerely want to ask people like Colonel Prouty and Congressman Gonzalez and Mr. Judge, how can it happen, if this is at all true, how does a U.S. ambassador, what kind of activities are going on that even a people in a sovereign country can believe that their country is being run by the U.S. ambassador and that negotiations that our executive branch is supporting for democracy are just a sham?
I'll try to allow some brief comments on it. I think the question is a little bit far from our subject.
Well, it isn't, because we're talking about the 1963 and covert activities.
Yes,
and that's
I understand, but you're standing there and I'm sitting here and we have to try and bring the program to a conclusion, and I'm sorry. Does somebody have something to say about the negotiations relating to the return of President Aristide to Haiti, or Haiti being run by the American ambassador? And I'm sorry, I didn't catch the thing about the American Bar Association. Maybe at the reception afterwards,
Yes,
we could deal with some of those questions. I'm going to take one last question.
I'm Sarah Cutler, and I'm an educator. And
I can't hear you.
I'm an educator, and I've been following the supra-constitutional, the process of going to war. And when the president said he didn't have to go to Congress for this last war, I've been following the legal advice, and I've been reading the articles in the various newspapers and contacting those lawyers, which led me to the American Bar Association Committee for National Security, which is very small. And it was started by somebody on the Committee on the Present Danger, which was originally started by an admiral in 1950. Then I heard about the committee again in 1974, but I didn't hear anything about that committee in the 60s. I expressed, at the ABA meetings, I found out about the U.S. Institute of Peace because some of those people were there, which brought me to their meetings. And there is an interlocking board between those three groups.
I'm sorry.
And there is...
I really don't want to cut you off, but this is well beyond the subject of our forum tonight, and I'll have to ask you to discuss this with the panelists at the reception afterwards, if you want to do it. I think that we have held on to a very loyal, committed, devoted audience, and I appreciate all of you for being here. I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions. There is a reception on the first floor of Mary Graydon Center. Before we go there, let me say a couple things with such a large audience in the hall. We will have additional forums in the American Forum series on Tuesday, February 11th, Monday, March 2nd, and Wednesday, April 1st in this room. If you would like to be on our mailing list, there are cards outside the doors so that you can get on the mailing list and be informed about the forums. I want to thank, once again, the people who have made these forums possible: the Xerox Foundation, the Washington Gas Light Company, the Xerox Foundation, the Washington Gas Light Company, Cable Holdings, and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation. And I want to thank Fletcher Prouty, Stephen Rosenfeld, Pat Dowell, Henry Gonzalez, John Judge, and Dan Moldea for being with us. Thank you.
For more information on this American Forum, you can write to the American University School of Communication at 4400 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest here in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 2